He turned off notifications from the get-go. He didn't want to get himself hooked. When he'd first signed up with the app, he'd checked every couple of hours to see if there were any hits. He'd go into the chat rooms at night and talk with other like-minded men, making a few friends, but nothing lasting. His schedule was too erratic for that. He'd met up with several men to relieve an itch, but they'd wanted more than he was willing to give them. He knew he was lucky that something bad hadn't happened. He wasn't completely stupid. Predators were everywhere. But he'd put a stop to that after realizing it wasn't worth the effort, nor the attitude from the men, when they realized he wasn't offering up his ass for their use, even though he'd explained himself before agreeing to meet them. Because he never disclosed his real hometown, he'd have to drive for hours for a couple minutes of fun. Hours he could be sleeping or working another shift. He couldn't justify the time sink, and how pathetic was that? He still occasionally chatted in the forums, but he kept himself to very short stints so he didn't get sucked in. They were addictive, like Facebook on crack, and he'd sit for hours chatting with complete strangers if he let himself. And he couldn't let himself. He had shit to do. He was working 3 jobs to help with the bills, hell, to pay all the bills. They were all equally shitty positions at equally shitty companies for equally shitty pay in an equally shitty little podunk town in western Pennsylvania. He'd be glad to see the last of it, if he could only save up enough money to move his little sister, Ciara, and himself. That was the goal, anyway. It was a lofty one, but one he couldn't stop trying to achieve, and he was proud to say he'd saved up quite a bit. They wouldn't make a move until Ciara was done with high school, but when she was, they'd be leaving. He'd never wanted to carry the burden of taking care of his family, being what amounted to a parent at 15, but that responsibility had landed on his shoulders regardless. The more responsibility he had to carry, the more there was to control, and the more he had to control, the more out of control he felt. The last thing he wanted was to be setting rules for his sister. In truth, what he really wanted was to have someone setting and enforcing rules for him. There was nothing in his life that didn't stress him out. It all snowballed on him until he was trampled by it and caught up in it as it rolled down a never-ending hill. He was dizzy and sick, and he wanted out, but he knew it wasn't likely any time soon. Hopefully, one day, someone would set down rules for him again, and he'd begin to feel calm. Realizing that he had a notification, he did his best not to get his hopes up. He'd been down that road before, and it was always a dead end. When he opened his messages and saw an automated email from TBC informing him of new potential daddies, his knees started to bounce with nerves. He clicked the message open and scanned the list of possible matches, but he'd seen them all before. Curious as to why he'd gotten a hit, No, wait. There was one he hadn't seen before. Clicking on the profile of the match, he couldn't help but sigh at the gorgeous man pictured. There were about 6 different shots, and try as he might to see flaws in all of them, there wasn't one to be found. Then he had to be a dick, right? Had to be. What was the catch? Because really, men like this didn't just fall in people's laps. He scoured the profile, and when he came to the man's list of kink preferences, he sucked in a ragged breath. They aligned with his almost perfectly. Jesus. Well, that was a first. For so long he had felt like what he wanted didn't exist. There was a name for his kink, sure, but finding others that wanted that type of play was nearly impossible. At least, it had been for him. But he liked everything he saw under Daddy Cash's profile. He was starting to get really excited, until he saw the man's location. Fuck. Well, that was that. Boston. Not even in the same state. Hadn't he put a specific distance within his search parameters? Obviously he hadn't. Shaking his head, he glanced down once more at that gorgeously rugged face. His phone buzzed in his hand, signaling an incoming message. Thinking it might be a message from his sister, he expected the text bubble to appear, but his eyes popped wide when he realized it was a personal message in his TBC inbox from none other than Daddy Cash. He glanced up, frustrated that the only daddy he'd ever seen with kinks that aligned so closely to his was states away, and realized he'd missed his bus stop. Fucking fuck, exactly what he needed. No umbrella, and he'd just given him